Could President Donald Trump secure himself a second term as US president? In this presentation, Nicholas Lorimer presents 4 scenarios that could come to pass on November 3rd in the 2020 US elections.
Welcome, everyone. Tonight's briefing is going to be on CRA's recently released report regarding the United States presidential election. Obviously, this is one of the biggest news stories in the world and something that will inevitably have a large effect globally, so something to understand very well. And I hand over to our analyst, Nicholas Lorimer, who will be presenting this and who is also the author of the report. So thank you very much. Nick, over to you.
Thanks very much, Nick. So, of course, this is a very important occasion, but a lot of people, I think, have a lot of questions exactly about how it's going to go. So this report that we've released today is an analysis essentially of the polling. Polling is not a perfect measure, as I'll explain, for forecasting elections, but it is a pretty good barometer. You can see other things such as how many people attend rallies, what turnout is in elections leading up to a major election like this, or what funding numbers are, to get an idea of how an election might go. But polling ultimately tends to be the most accurate of all the ways of guessing how an election is going to go. Right, so I think it's very important to start with what exactly, let me just go through what we'll talk about today. We're going to talk about what exactly a poll is, the strategy the campaigns will be using, what polls say about each demographic group nationally, an alternative view from some of the Maverick Pulses, what the swing state polling will be, is currently, and then some scenarios about how this might play out. At the end, I'll assign some probabilities to those various scenarios, and then we'll talk very briefly about, does it matter who wins? Right, so let's start with what is a poll, because I think it's just important to be reminded of the basics. A poll is just a sample of the electorate. Ideally, if you take a random sample of any population and you ask people in that group for their opinions, they will give you a pretty accurate representation of the group as a whole. Depending on the sample size, which can be a few hundreds to a few thousands, you might get replies that are a little bit out of whack with exactly what the final result will be, and that's what we call the margin of error. But in order to make an accurate poll, a pollster needs to know what the electorate is actually going to look like. What percentage will be women? What percentage will be men? What percentage will be from this area or that area? And that's where some of the difficulties can come in. You need to make sure that your sample weights correctly all of the individual demographic groups that you might find within the electorate. So, for example, let's say that you need to have 6% of your electorate needs to be Black men for it to be accurate. If your sample that you pull only has 3% Black men in it, then you'll rate all of the answers given by that 3% twice as valuable as you would if you had perfect representativity. So that means that if you get that weighting wrong, things can go a little bit off. With that in mind, let's go to what happened in 2016. So the thing you'll hear a lot of people say is 2016, the polls got it wrong. Well, let's examine that a little bit closely, because there's a little bit of truth in that, but there's also a bit of untruth in that. So this is a final polling average from Real Clear Politics of the last couple of days of the election. This is the national vote poll, and you can see that the average of all the polls had Clinton up by 3.2. She ended up winning the popular vote by 2.1 points. So she was only 1 point off compared to what the national polls are. And yet we have President Trump, not President Clinton. And let me go into that, why that is. So if you look at this, don't worry too much about all this. Let's just start here with the popular vote. The popular vote was won by Hillary Clinton by about 3 million votes, which is in line with what the poll said. However, when it came to polling some of the states, and now remember, in the United States, the election is decided not by who gets the most votes overall, but who the states elect. And the states have a certain number of electors that are granted to them based on proportion of the population that they make up of the United States, but it doesn't exactly match, which accounts for the discrepancy. And so the state polls, which give you a more accurate representation of who's going to win the election, tended to be off. So while the national polls are only off by about 1%, in some states, and notably Wisconsin, the polls were off by 7%. So that resulted in the Electoral College, despite state polling suggesting that Hillary was going to win, Trump won 304 electors to Hillary Clinton's 207. And you need 270 to win. And so, of course, Trump became president. Now, let's look very briefly at why some of those polls were wrong. The first thing to note is that the results were extremely narrow. If you look at the states here, the one with the 10 on it is Wisconsin, the one with the 16 on it is Michigan, the one with the 29 on it is Florida, and the one with the 20 on it is Pennsylvania. And next to them is the total number of votes cast in that state and the margin by which Trump won by. So you see in a state like Florida, he won it by about sort of 1%, a little bit more than that. So he won it by 112,000 votes, which is a fairly comfortable amount to win a state by. But in a state like Michigan, he only won it by 10,000 votes, which is 0.2% of the total votes cast. So that shows us that the race was a lot closer than either the popular vote graph or the electoral vote number would suggest. And so that's one of the reasons that the polls were off. They didn't see how narrow Trump's victory would be. There's also another factor, which is that the electorate, in part of that weighting I talked about at the beginning, they needed to weight correctly for each group. And one of the groups that they failed to weight correctly for were white voters with a university or a college education. Those voters turned out were some of the biggest supporters of Donald Trump, and perhaps unexpectedly so, because previously they often have voted in higher numbers for the Democrats. Hillary Clinton performed particularly badly with this group, and because they were not well represented enough in polls tended to underrepresent Trump's eventual margins in states. And so you see states where there are lots of white voters without a university education, for example, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, Trump did much better than polls expected, although it varied. So he did 7 points better than the polls in Wisconsin. However, in Philadelphia, he only did about 3 points better than the polls. And I think in Michigan, it was about 2 points better. I do go into this in the report in a little bit more detail. The other thing we should take note of is undecided voters. So the polls often don't assign voters who say that they can't decide between the two candidates. And in 2016, both candidates were extremely unpopular. This meant that there was an enormous number of voters who hadn't made up their mind right until the last minute. And those voters, usually in an election, they break about 50-50 for each candidate. In this election, they broke, I think it was about 70-30 in Trump's favor, which meant at the last minute, he had a big surge in support. And so the polls may have been accurate, or at least more accurate, but were undone by this. So to prevent that happening, a candidate needs to be around 50% of the vote in a state in order to be sure that undecided voters won't swing it the other way. Hillary Clinton was around 47% in a lot of those states. Trump finished just slightly ahead of her. The last problem that we're going to talk about is that in 2016, too few of those states had good quality polls. So it's difficult, it's beyond the scope of this to talk about what exactly makes a quality poll. Suffice to say that there weren't enough of them in 2016 in some of these key swing states, particularly Wisconsin, which the polls are varied in quality greatly. So what's the lesson we should take away from looking at 2016 polls? Well, I think the first one is that a sense of complete certainty about the election result is a fool's game. And this was very evident in 2016, as some pointed out. Trump was only about one average polling error behind Clinton. And as it turned out, the polling error was in his favor and he won. With that in mind, let's now move on to what the strategy of the parties will be and targeting each demographic. This is very important for campaigning. So firstly, let's go to Trump. He will seek to shore up his most loyal voter base. This is white voters without a university degree and rural voters. These voters backed him by about 35% more than Hillary Clinton in 2016. He also wants to hold on to as much support with white voters with a university degree. These are voters who narrowly backed him last time, but there's some evidence to suggest that they are slipping away from him. He wants to make inroads with Black men and Hispanics, who are traditionally heavily voting for the Democrats. However, Trump's campaign has tried to pull off some of these voters. He also wants to make sure that older voters, which are one of the most important constituencies for his Republican Party, turn out in large numbers and also vote for him. Biden wants to use some of the leftover Obama magic, which saw a lot of white voters without university degrees vote for the Democrats, to vote for him, or perhaps just depress turnout amongst them. Let's say they don't feel so strongly about voting against him. He also wants to build support amongst white suburban university educated voters, particularly women, who polling suggests are particularly offended by Trump. He wants to make sure as many Black voters come to the polls as possible. The Democratic Party tends to get more than 80%, sometimes more than 90% of Black voters, and therefore making sure they turn out to vote is very important for swinging the election to him. He also wants to make sure that non-Cuban Hispanics come to the polls. Cubans are different from other Hispanics in that they tend to vote for the Republicans rather than for the Democrats. He also wants to win Cuban Hispanics. So let's see what national polling suggests about each of these demographics. So let's start with Trump. So far, polls have suggested that Trump is in trouble with older voters. Mid-October polling shows that his support has shrunk. There's a bit of an error there, just says 1 point. Actually, it was by, it's down from 10 to 15 points ahead of the Democrats with older voters, down to about 1 point ahead of the Democrats with older voters. And that's probably due to old people tending to be more affected by COVID, which there's a general perception out there that Biden would be better at handling COVID than Trump. He is also not doing quite as well with non-university educated white voters. Now, he's still doing very well with them. He's winning by at least 20 points, but there is at least a little bit of evidence that Joe Biden has made a little bit of inroads there. Not enough to win that group by any margin, but enough to reduce Trump's advantage with it. This suggests that he'll be far weaker than perhaps he might have been in 2016 in the swing states of Pennsylvania, Michigan, Ohio, and Wisconsin, and Minnesota. We will, of course, examine that a little bit later. Amongst minority voters, Trump is actually doing better than expected. So many people don't know this, but Trump did better than Mitt Romney, who ran for the Republican ticket in 2012, amongst Black and Hispanic voters in 2016. And polls are suggesting that this might continue. Trump support has increased from 28% of Hispanics to somewhere around 33 to 40% of Hispanics now supporting him. It's difficult to tell. When you talk about smaller groups in a poll, you tend to find that they are, the margin of error is greater because they are a much smaller sample size. An interesting dynamic of this election, though, is how big of a role gender is playing. So generally speaking, in an election, men and women tend to vote quite similarly to each other, particularly in American elections. However, this time it looks like Trump is behind by 17% in some polls with female voters. However, he's winning with male voters, so he's ahead by 9%. And nationally, he's up by 7% with male voters. So now let's go and look at Biden and what his strategy is going to be. Biden is performing much better than Democrats usually do with older voters. Older voters tended to vote Republican by sort of 10 to 15% margins. However, he's almost tied with Trump in many polls, although once again, there's some variance between polls. With women, as I said, he's up 17 points with female voters. And this is very good because women tend to vote at higher rates than men. And as a result, if you had to choose a gender to support you, you'd choose women if you were running for election in the US. Let's look at race. Biden is holding quite strong with Black voters. However, most worryingly for him, he seems to be underperforming a bit with Hispanic voters. And these voters are particularly important in places like Florida and Arizona, where they make up much larger percentages of the population. With regards to education level, Biden tends to have very strong support amongst people with college degrees, particularly minorities with college degrees, but also with white voters with college degrees, which is a shift from the 2016 election, where these voters narrowly backed Trump. Biden is also, as I mentioned before, stronger with those white voters without a university education than Clinton was. But this isn't the only view amongst pollsters. There are a few Maverick pollsters. One of them is a group called the Trafalgar Group. They're one of the more prominent of the Maverick pollsters. They are taken seriously because in 2016, against most of the other polls, they predicted that Trump would win Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Florida. However, it's a bit difficult to reach a firm conclusion with their track record. They do not have a long track record in polling. Let me just, they are suggesting that this time in 2020, Trump will perform similarly well in some of those key states, particularly Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. However, it's worth noting that Trump is not doing so well in very red states. And I take as an example here the states of Georgia and Texas. Georgia voted for Trump by about, I think, 4 points last time. And the polls were quite accurate in predicting that. And they voted for him by 9 points in Texas, which actually slightly underperformed his polls. He was expected to win by 11 in Texas. He only won by 9. Current voting averages show that Trump is only up by about 1 in both Georgia and Texas, which is not a good place to be. As has been mentioned, the Rust Belt states, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Ohio, Minnesota, these polls seem to be slipping away from Trump. And of course, that happened in 2016, but identifying those issues that I mentioned earlier with the polling in those states, many pollsters say that they have fixed those issues and now their current polls will be more accurate regarding those states. We will have to see, of course. So why is this Trafalgar Group worth looking at? Well, here's what they say. They of course, called it correctly in 2016 in many states. They say they have an unorthodox polling method, which protects the anonymity of voters. They claim to look beyond social pressure, which they say is to Biden's advantage because people are embarrassed to say they're voting for Trump. However, there's a lot of criticism being leveled at them. Opponents are accusing them of being a very partisan firm with ties to the Republican Party. The founder, I think, worked for the Republican Party in South Carolina for many years. They're also accused of using unscientific methods to produce good news for Republicans. And Trump has boosted this group very heavily while he's campaigned, saying that they're the only pollsters who are not lying. However, many of their opponents believe that their prediction in 2016 was more due to sheer luck rather than accuracy. And there is some evidence for that. They predicted Trump would win by 4 in Florida. He actually did sort of 3 points worse than that. Right. So let's look at some of these swing states. There's essentially 2 groups of states. So think of these as, so just to clarify, a swing state is a state where there is a very high chance of the state flipping to one candidate or the other. It's not certain who exactly is going to win that. If you win those states, you win the presidency. There are 2 main groups of swing states. The ones in the Rust Belt, so that's Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Minnesota, Wisconsin. And then there are swing states in the Sun Belt states, and that's Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, Arizona, and arguably Texas. So why do we group these states together? Because they have very roughly similar demographics. White non-college educated voters tend to be very important in the Rust Belt, and Hispanics and Black voters tend to be very important in Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, the Sun Belt states. So as mentioned, Trump is far behind by various metrics in the Rust Belt states. In Pennsylvania, he's currently, according to 538's average of polls, 5 points behind Biden. In Michigan, he is 8 points behind Biden. And in Wisconsin, he is 9.1 points behind Biden, which would require a larger polling error than carried him to victory in 2016 to be overcome. So with this in mind, let's talk about some scenarios of how this might play out. So these are the 4 scenarios we've kind of envisioned here. So let's start with the first one. This is a Biden close victory. The Biden close victory assumes that the polls will tighten a bit in the last few days of the campaign. So basically in the stretch we're in now. And also that there will be a polling error of about 3% in Trump's favor. And this is because those white voters without a college degree who were crucial to Trump's victory in 2016 turn out to be very difficult to poll accurately. There has been trouble polling them in the past. In 2012, some of their support for Obama was missed. So the polling error was actually in the Democrats' favor in 2012. But it was in part due to those voters again throwing things out. So we can assume perhaps that those voters in this scenario their support for Trump is underplayed. Democrats, however, turn out in very big numbers because in 2018, they registered an enormous number of voters. Trump loses older voters who are scared by the coronavirus, and also women come out in huge numbers to vote against Trump because they are not a fan of his style of politics. In this scenario, Trump gains with Black and Hispanic voters, allowing him to win the southern states in the Sun Belt. However, he doesn't win back the Rust Belt states, which is actually where Biden is from. Biden was born in Pennsylvania, and he was a senator for Delaware for most of his career, which is just next to Pennsylvania. In this scenario, we see Biden winning relatively narrowly in the Electoral College and winning the popular vote more comfortably, maybe getting around 300 or 290 Electoral College votes, which is more than the 270 he needs to win. Let's go to the next one, which is a narrow Trump victory. In this case, Trump has a very good last week of campaigning. He's more focused and more active than Biden, who's been playing it very safe for a lot of the campaign, not making a lot of campaign appearances. In this scenario, pollsters fail to account for white non-college voters again, but to an even greater margin than in the previous scenario. And also, there are a lot of voters who are scared to say that they are voting for Trump because they fear reprisals, because many anti-Trump partisans are very aggressive in their disposition. And so this sees these voters all coming out. Democratic voters are not enthusiastic about voting for Biden, and so they don't turn out quite as expected. Also, the Republicans have actually managed to register more voters than the Democrats in some of those key swing states this year, mostly because the Democrats have been afraid of breaking social distancing. This is one of the differences between the two campaigns. The Trump campaign has been much more blasé about social distancing and COVID, whereas the Biden campaign has taken it extremely seriously. This causes Trump to win the Rust Belt, and he manages, with the help of that growth in Black and Hispanic support, to hold on to Florida and Georgia. So the good turnout basically wins him the Sun Belt, and he manages to keep at least some of the Rust Belt states that he won in 2016. And most importantly, Pennsylvania, which is worth 20 Electoral College votes. In this scenario, Trump loses the popular vote, but narrowly wins in the Electoral College, perhaps getting about 290 votes, which is enough to win. Let's go to the next scenario, which is a Biden landslide. In this scenario, the Democrats are highly motivated to vote after 4 years of a president that they really can't stand. Trump has taken a knock because voters blame him for handling the COVID crisis not very badly. Pollsters were so focused on making sure they didn't miss any Republican or Trump-friendly voters that they actually undercount Democrats. This scenario sees Biden outperforming his polls by about 2 percentage points, which causes him to win every single one of the swing states, as well as a popular vote margin that matches Obama or possibly exceeds him in 2008. And then there's one last scenario to just consider, but we'll get to this in a second, which is a tie. So the tie is kind of, in between the close Biden win and the narrow Trump win, probably sees Biden winning the popular vote again, But if Trump wins some of the swing states, such as Arizona, Florida, Georgia, Ohio, and Wisconsin, as well as the single electors in Maine and Nebraska, although don't worry too much about those because they're probably not going to come into play, both candidates end up with 269 electoral votes, which is one short of the 270 needed to win. This is a bit of a conundrum because it then sets off a complicated process. The American Constitution holds that in the event of a tie where no candidate gets 270 votes in the Electoral College, the House of Representatives will form state delegations and elect the president, and the Senate will elect the vice president. It's a very complicated process. We don't need to get into it. The only time anything like it has ever happened was in the year 1800, when the US was still a very new country. And it took 35 rounds of voting in the House to finally break the deadlock. And I think Thomas Jefferson won the election there. Right. So now we should talk which of these is most likely. So in my opinion, the Biden close victory is the most likely scenario. Main reason for this is that Trump would have to have a polling error of a magnitude similar to or greater than he had in the previous cycle, which I think is unlikely because pollsters have made efforts to reduce this. I also think it's difficult for an incumbent to win in a year where everything is kind of going wrong, as it has. And generally speaking, voters tend to rate Trump as very poorly dealing with the COVID crisis, which is one of course, the biggest issues of 2020, and as a result will be the reason that Biden is able to win over a lot of voters who may have voted for Trump in 2016. I also think that because of Trump's particular personality, he's very good at motivating Democrats to go out to the polls. However, that being said, do not discount the possibility of the other two. Likely does not mean certain. A Trump narrow victory is still very possible. If there is, in say Pennsylvania, a polling error of 6 points, which would be less than Wisconsin in 2016, you will actually see Trump win that state. If Trump wins that state and he wins some of the Sunbelt states, places like Arizona and Florida, Trump's chances of actually snatching victory by a small margin are quite significant. There are a number of combinations by which you could reach this, but suffice to say that it's definitely not beyond the bounds of possibility. And one of the lessons, like I said, of 2016 was don't be absolutely certain, because we're not working with perfect data here. So a Trump narrow victory is still possible. However, it would require very large polling errors, and so I think it's unlikely. Also, don't discount the possibility of a Biden landslide. Like I said, pollsters have been very focused on making sure that they get to speak to Republican voters. That might see them undercount some Biden voters. Some people are also expecting Biden voters to be less motivated because they don't like Joe Biden as much as Trump supporters like Trump. However, like I said, Democrats are motivated to vote against Trump. So Democrat turnout could be huge. And this might result in Biden doing slightly better than his polls, as Democrats did in 2012, which saw them win much more comfortably when it was Obama versus Mitt Romney than polls had suggested. There's a couple of other things to note also in this election. There is a much smaller number of undecided voters this time. Polls are putting the number of undecided voters in 2016 in some of the swing states, there were about 10% of the electorate. This time, they're down to 5% in some polls, they're down to 3% in some polls, and I saw one that came out today that had only 1% of voters undecided. And in a lot of these swing states, Biden is managing to stay above that 50% mark, which means the final sort of last-minute deciding voters are unlikely to save Trump. There's also a huge number of early votes. As I'm speaking to you, 53% of all the votes cast in 2016 have already been cast in this election because of early voting in various states, particularly in Texas, where 90% of 2016's turnout has already voted. The last thing is that there are some projections which expect an enormous turnout in this election, which might cause a bit of uncertainty because pollsters may have modeled badly for that. One polling firm is predicting the largest turnout in any American election in terms of percentage points since 1908, so more than 100 years. I think that the tie is very unlikely, and that's because there needs to be a very specific combination of states that makes up the tie. Generally states, if there's a polling error, let's say with one type of voter, so if polls are off in Pennsylvania, they're likely to also be off in the same direction in Wisconsin and Michigan, and the same in places like Florida and Arizona. So it would be some sheer dumb luck in order for it to end up in a tie. There is this polling group called 538. Well, they're polling aggregator and analyzer. They model elections. They've run 40,000 scenarios of how the election could go. They see a tie happening in less than 1% of those. So I don't think it's likely, but just think about it because it has quite serious consequences. All right, so let's finish up here by saying, does it really matter who wins? Well, so long as there's no tie and so long as there's no long delays, and I can go into the possibility of that perhaps in the Q&A section, markets will probably be quite happy in the short term. This is, of course, because Trump did not spook markets in 2016 and likely won't if he wins re-election, just like some people thought he would spook markets in 2016, he didn't. Biden is in favor of greater spending. If he wins, the Democrats in Congress are likely to open up the floodgates of the spending and allow him to pass some very big COVID relief packages, which in the short term, at least, markets will probably be quite happy with. Both parties have become quite anti-China. Whether this means Trump's trade war will continue, I think is probably unlikely, but both parties will still take actions against China. So don't expect that to change. They do differ, however, on climate policy, the view towards the Islamic Republic of Iran, tax policy and healthcare, and these will be quite significant differences. And the Democrats may try to pass legislation. There's also one more thing to take into account. The Senate it's unclear who's going to be the majority party in the Senate. If Biden wins it, his agenda will probably be far more left-wing. If the Republicans manage to keep control of the Senate, then his agenda will have to be scaled back because he'll have to cooperate with the Republicans in the Senate. You can, of course, read more about this in the report put out by the CRA, and as well as other products and services that the CRA offers, and also our CEO, Frans Cronje's book, The Rise and Fall of South Africa.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to give it a like. For more of our insights and analysis, make sure to subscribe to this channel. If you haven't already, sign up for our 30-day free trial, which will give you access to our exclusive client briefings, reports, and weekly risk alerts. You can follow the link in the description box below.